couple of minutes just to allow more participants to join. So bear with us, we will start in about 1 or 2 minutes. So we're just waiting for a couple of minutes for participants to join, and then we'll be starting. Super. So thank you very much for joining us on this webinar, talking about innovation in the UK and the impact of the tax landscape on it. This is highly topical in light of the autumn budget that was last week, where the government announced that it's committed to increasing total investment in R&D to 2.4% by 2027, as well as reforming the R&D tax credits rules to include more categories of qualifying expenditure and to make it more domestically focused. I'm Carrie Rutland, a partner in the Innovation and Technology Group at BDO, and I will be chairing this session. As this webinar is being recorded, we will be taking questions at the end of the session, so please submit them via the Zoom function. I'm delighted to be joined by the CBI, so we have Vanessa O'Donnell and Sheldon Brown, who are Senior Tax Policy Advisors, by Kinetic and Peter Montague-Fuller, Head of Tax there, and a colleague of mine, Katie Rabinjan, who's an R&D Director at BDO. Reese, can you move the slides, please? So this is a bit of sort of what we will be covering, today's agenda. So Vanessa will start us off on talking about how the UK can become a global innovation hub. Then we'll hear from Peter on some sort of practical examples in an industry perspective. Sheldon will talk about overcoming the barriers to business innovation. And then Katie will wrap up on sort of an insight into HMRC's sort of current thinking and their increased focus on R&D claims. And then we'll be doing Q&A at the end. So I'll hand over now to Vanessa, who will start us off in our discussion.
Thank you, Carrie, and good morning, everyone. I'm Vanessa O'Donnell, Senior Policy Advisor at the CBI, and I'm going to be talking to you today about how the UK can become a global innovation hub. So I'm sure most of you will agree that with the onset of the pandemic, innovation and technology have been centre stage in how we've responded to COVID-19. And I think this offers a really clear illustration of the ways in which the UK already is a global innovation leader. And certainly as we fire up our economy and chart our path to net zero, innovation will continue to be at the forefront of how we adapt to new challenges and remain both productive and competitive. So as we think about how the UK can become a global innovation hub, I think one of the critical underpinning conditions is for the government to share this ambition, but also be committed to seeing it translated into reality. So it's really welcome that one of the central ambitions of the current government is to become a science superpower. This is absolutely a pledge which has united the business community, as well as the university and science sectors alike. But we all know ambitions, as vital as they are never enough to deliver in practice. So beyond the rhetoric, how do we deliver against these aims? While there are several factors at play, including access to talent, ensuring we have a pro-innovation regulatory system, as well as digital connectivity, all of which were highlighted in the Khalifa report recently. Today, I'm going to focus on two core ingredients to becoming a global innovation hub, and they include investment, ensuring that we fuel the ambitions to reach science superpower status and support innovation and unlocking business investment in this area. And secondly, providing a clear direction on the long-term strategic focuses for the UK And in this area, it's really vital that we ensure the UK focuses on where we already have a global competitive edge and provide a valuable steer to businesses on what the industries of the future will look like in the UK. So firstly, on investment, where are we? Well, this webinar is particularly well timed given that we had the CSR last week, and this shone a light on the government's latest ambitions and their longer term plans. Usually in budgets, there is a fleeting nod to innovation, but this year the Chancellor spoke at relative length about the measures to deliver an innovation economy, and that was particularly welcome. So the key announcements included pledges to increase public R&D spending from 14 billion to 20 billion by 2024-25, and a longer term commitment to increase public R&D spend to 22 billion, and that will be reached by 26-27. So while this is a really welcome trajectory, as many had anticipated, the government's previous headline commitment to spend 22 billion has been delayed by a couple of years. The other thing to note is that funding has been heavily backloaded, so we'll have to wait until 2024 to see much of the growth in spend. So what do these announcements mean for fostering a global innovation hub? So firstly, we need to have a look at how our investment tallies up with our global competitors. And many of those are investing with both scale and urgency. So there are questions over whether or not our commitments will go far enough or fast enough to compete with our international competitors. The government has retained the target to achieve R&D investment of 2.4% as a proportion of GDP, and the target for this is 2027. To reach this would be transformational, but it would bring R&D investments in line with the EU average. And for context, in the USA, they are investing 2.7%, Germany at 2.9%, Japan at 3.4%, and South Korea at 4.1%. So as well as looking at our headline investments, we really need to keep an eye on how our investment is keeping pace with international trends if we are to remain competitive. Given this, it's really important that if the UK is to become a global innovation hub, 2.4% has to be a milestone rather than an endpoint. Secondly, it's important to consider the business aspect and how confidence has been impacted by the decisions last week. While the direction of travel is broadly good, we have seen delays to the commitment of 22 billion. And with the backloading of budgetary increases, it has a potential to dampen overall business investment. So while some of the announcements last week were slightly disappointing, nevertheless, the 22 billion target has been retained, and that is very positive. I think now to maintain business confidence, what we must do is ensure that those timeframes don't shift any further, but also work with the government, and CBI will be working with our members to ensure that the money that has been committed is put to good use. Before I move on to how the money has been spent, I think it's important to note that actually, given the delays in growth public R&D spending, it will be really important now that the UK double down on wider measures that are non-financial, and the innovation strategy included a series of efforts to boost awareness and accessibility of support across the ecosystem, which is notoriously complex to navigate. And in the CBI Tech Tracker from 2020, 10% of SMEs and 12% of large businesses said that the number one thing that would help them to innovate more would be a better understanding and navigability of the existing business innovation support. So it's important to remember that the financial commitments, although very important, they're not the only factor which influences how far we can reach our to become a global innovation hub. So looking beyond the levels of spend, we also saw some positive signs last week on the direction of spend, and we saw a greater focus on innovation. So while the core research budget increased, we also saw a substantial increase for Innovate UK, and that will represent a 36% increase across the period and take the budget to 1.1 billion by 24-25. So this is a really positive development and echoes the direction of travel illustrated in the innovation strategy, where we saw the inclusion of innovation adoption in the strategy for the first time. And Innovate UK's objectives have now been expanded to include adoption and diffusion of cutting edge innovation. So this will be really important to demonstrating the UK as a global innovation hub, as having a market for innovation is absolutely a factor in investment decisions, and driving innovation adoption is another tool to improve the environment for investment in R&D. And to take a real world example, testing and demonstration capabilities are often a vital step in the route to market for innovation. And rarely can one company actually host these facilities or fund these facilities alone. But beyond that, there is a wider applicability across businesses for these infrastructure facilities. So there is absolutely a case for public support. And we look forward to working with Innovate UK in how that money is spent. So turning now to tax credits, the CSR represented a number of positive steps on that, and we've called for the R&D tax credit system to be modernised. And it's really welcome that the scope has been widened to include cloud and data services. I think the consultation has been a really important opportunity to refresh the system to make sure it's an effective driver of business investment and ensure that we deliver a globally competitive R&D tax credit system. We've already seen significant enhancements to fiscal incentives for inward investment across the EU and the US. And to remain competitive, we have to make sure that we keep pace with this. In terms of the longer term direction and the signals that this can provide to businesses on where they should invest their money, the Government Innovation Strategy released this summer marks a really important step in fostering the UK as a global innovation hub. And we were really pleased to see the scale of ambition and focus on unleashing business innovation and investment. Some of the key takeaways from the innovation strategy were the new missions programme, which will be defined by the National Science and Technology Council, and also the 7 new technology families, which will act as priority areas for the UK. So what does this mean for delivering a global innovation hub? I think firstly, it provides much needed direction to businesses on the areas they should prioritise, but the CBI are now working to seek greater clarity on what backing these technology areas will actually look like in practice. So what we do know from the innovation strategy is that the new National Science and Technology Council, which is being headed up by Patrick Vallance, will now engage in a prioritisation process whereby they will select a range of missions and technologies to focus on. And critical to this process will be engaging with the business community to ensure that there is buy-in across industry for the adopted missions and technologies. The other thing that will be really important to delivering in this space is to ensure that the process is not a drawn out process. And we need to maintain momentum from the strategy and avoid any unnecessary delays to investment decisions. While the tech families do provide a good starting point for prioritisation, there are some gaps, for example, telecoms, and the CBI will be working with members and government to make sure that we ensure it's a holistic approach. So hopefully that's provided you with a useful insight into how we can become a global innovation hub. But I'll just finish on 2 final things that will be coming out in the months ahead that will further shape the UK's innovation offer. And the first is the consultation on regulation, which was announced in the innovation strategy. And that will seek to ensure that the UK is well placed to extract the best value from innovation. The second is the eagerly anticipated place-based strategy. And this will feature in the Levelling Up white paper and will give us more of an indication of how the government seeks to create poles for regional innovation capabilities. Thank you for listening, and I'll hand over back to Carrie.
Thank you, Vanessa. And that's, really interesting and sort of very much puts our conversation in context. Peter, I've got a question for you, if that's okay. So picking up on what Vanessa was saying, I was just interested in knowing how much innovation incentives in a particular country drives kinetic sort of investment decisions and where you locate R&D.
It's a very good point, and it's a very important point. We assess on a global scale the opportunities for investment in R&D programs. As a defense business, it's difficult to place many of the programs in certain territories, but we do assess the home countries, Australia, US, UK, Canada, and Europe, our European subsidiaries, against their R&D territories and their credentials. Amongst other things, it's not a singular decision based on R&D incentives, but it's a very important decision to determine our investment criteria for whether or not we should be investing in a particular technology in a particular territory. Obviously, skills and capability are very high on that list as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And Katie, does that mirror what you're seeing with your client base?
Well, while larger businesses can decide where they locate those different things, often with the SMEs, they're an international presence, but there's less choice over where they locate those. There might be other commercial factors that drive the location of different R&D. I think when you look at the UK and compare it to other of our neighbours, it's a game of two halves. So the R&D SME scheme in the UK is more generous than several of our competitors. If you look at, say, Ireland at 25%, or Spain and Germany also offering up to 25% credits, that's quite a different picture. Whereas when you look at the RDEC rate in the UK, currently at 10.5%, that does seem less attractive. So it is quite different depending on the size of business that you're looking at and the scale of international operations.
Thank you. Brilliant. So we've talked a little bit about R&D reliefs. The government also wanted to encourage companies to commercialise their IP that's created through the R&D in the UK. So it introduced the Patent Box scheme in 2013. And this gives an attractive, effective 10% rate of tax on profits derived from products incorporating qualifying IP, such as patents. And since 2016, this has been very closely tied to where the R&D is located through the nexus fraction. Broadly speaking, the more UK R&D linked to the patent, the more profits qualify for the 10% tax rate. This all sounds good in theory, but how does it work in practice? Let's hear some practical examples from a firm that's used R&D and tax credits and the Patent Box to support its business model in the UK. And I'll hand you over to Peter.
Good morning, everyone. My name's Peter Montague. I'm head of tax at Kinetic, a UK headquartered multinational technology company working in the aerospace and defence sector. Kinetic, just to kind of put some background into Kinetic and its predecessor DERA, which was the Defence Evaluation Research Agency, has a long heritage of R&D and patent development, patent exploitation. The heritage is seen in your everyday screens on your mobile phones. We developed LCDs and licensed those LCDs over to Korea and Japan, and is now continuing to be exploited. We were center stage in the World Wide Web, and we hosted the Queen when we had she sent the first email across the Atlantic to the US, and we've developed microwave technology. So it's a great place to work, full of fascinating people, lots of fascinating stories, and I'm hoping to kind of bring to light some of those in the next few slides. We've been claiming innovation credits and incentives, in particular R&D relief, since its outset and the start in 2004 as a large corporation. R&D is central to our business, and RDEC is center stage of that. Keeping ahead of R&D is really important to a defense business because we need to keep ahead of threats to security and livelihoods, and supporting our defense and commercial customers. Now, while R&D is embedded in our business, we're regularly challenged by HM Treasury and others to demonstrate that RDEC is working as an incentive to R&D. So I'm hoping that the next two case studies will give you a flavour of why I think they are working, and maybe bring to light some of the kind of R&D that's going on in the UK, and make you feel marginally proud of being in the UK, to be quite frank. If you don't mind moving to the next slide, Reese. So the first slide is a slide showing the Bepi Colombo mission, a ESA program, recognizing our friends over in Europe. It's a propulsion system. Now, Kinetic developed way back when the solar electric propulsion system, and that system is now enabling the ESA Bepi Colombo mission to reach an orbit around Mercury. It was launched in 2018, although it was planned to be launched in 2012, but due to technical challenges, it kept on being pushed back, and is due to arrive in orbit around Mercury in 2025, a 7-year journey. Now, traditional and conventional spacecraft propulsion systems would not get the craft to Mercury over such a long cycle. So the solar electric propulsion system was developed by Kinetic to enable that craft to get to that planet. Effectively, although we refer to it as a propulsion system, actually it's braking. It's trying to withstand the sun's gravitational pull, and it's using, and it's called Bepi Colombo. It's using a swing bind maneuver, which was developed by a famous mathematician and scientist called Giuseppe Colombo, using various flybys, first of Earth, these have already happened, and 2 of Venus, and then finally 6 orbits of Mercury before 6 flybys of Mercury before it then goes into orbit around Mercury. And rather fittingly, it did its first Mercury flyby on the 1st of October, a month ago, the same date of Giuseppe's, if he had lived to see his 101st birthday. This same technology is now, we're looking at commercial applications for it, commercial satellites, and there are also kind of talk of whether or not this might be useful for future interplanetary travel, something which is obviously very headlines, and also with the spaceport in Unst, it could be very interesting that it could be a UK-led innovation and development. Now, RDEC has been claimed on this program since 2008, when we first bid for the Bepi Colombo mission, and it's continued to be claimed since launch and even beyond, while we continue to do various technical testing and demonstration to our ESA customer. HMRC visited the site, which was great. It's very nice to get them out and get them to see some of the science. And they visited our electric propulsion facility based out in Farnborough in 2014. And they were able to see the small blue glow, which was effectively the plasma propulsion that was driving the system. Like the science, RDEC, and I think demonstrating since 2008 that we've been claiming the RDEC, and it's 2021, and we still have another few years of this cycle before it actually reaches orbit. Like the science, we feel that RDEC is really important to being a patient capital, something which provides certainty and stability to businesses like Kinetic when we face risks and challenges of doing very difficult R&D programs like this. The mission faced very many technical difficulties, not least things like the plasma corrosion on the facility lining, which was an old facility dating back to the 1970s, 1980s, which had to be thoroughly modernized. And also the very long and tough and test regimes that had to be done. We had to do 8,000 hours for the existing system. So it was a really important, and it had to face very extreme temperatures. So for me, you're seeing pictures on the right-hand side of the craft itself, Bepi Colombo himself, and the orbit, and you're seeing that the RDEC in some small way allowed us to send this craft all the way to Mercury. So it's a really important for us to think about that when we're talking in more generalities about these types of programs. It's providing financial risk and cover for our program when we face very many technical challenges in R&D. Do you mind going to the next slide? We're showing another propulsion system. Now this is slightly more down to earth on terra firma, but it's an EX drive, and I guess it's referred to as EX drive. It's our proprietary system. It was developed by our power management team, who are based out of Farnborough as well. I'm talking about propulsion systems here, but QinetiQ has many other very interesting system developments beyond propulsion, but I'm just kind of limiting this discussion to propulsion. The power management team has developed this thing called an electric transmission drive, which was born out of a development from the 1990s, where we're looking at wheel vehicles, and then further developed with looking at tracked vehicles from 2004. And QinetiQ has developed this thing we call the EX drive, improving the propulsion systems and platform design, and it's kind of providing greater torque, reduced weight, and better agility and protection for our troops when they, particularly the risks that were faced by improvised explosive devices when they're in hostile territories. The EX drive provides power to individual wheels rather than a conventional transmission system with all the metal that comes under the hull of an armored vehicle. The system has undergone very significant prototyping and testing in the UK and the US, and it's currently a technology demonstrator under a US Office of Naval Research program. Now, QinetiQ is the only non-US contractor under that program, which is demonstrating how strong our science base is in respect to this. We're also working with Defence Science and Technology Laboratories on a wheeled version of the mobility test rig, a picture of which you can see in the middle, with has potentials for trains and other large goods vehicles. Now, this development encountered, like the Bepi Colombo, encountered many technical difficulties on its scalability, performance, and and certainly the thermal performance of its motors. And again, RDEC has been claimed since inception and demonstrating kind of really the long lead times that scientific research has before you can come to a production unit. The invention also shows how great our scientists are, and that we can compete globally, because we're competing with the US and many other international organizations to win this program of record over in the US. And we need these facilities to help develop and prove these technologies, and RDEC makes it a really important financial support for that, for those developments. So it's another big win, and you know, I feel very proud to be part of a company which can compete on something which is, you know, very topical, electric drives, and looking at very large vehicles, not looking at your standard automotive designs. So do you mind moving to the last slide, if you don't mind, Reese? That'd be great. As I mentioned, QinetiQ has many other developments. I want to mention a few just to show that we're not a one-trick pony on propulsion systems, but we have things like the XNet, the alarm for saving lives, which basically helps our troops in hostile environments and identifies security risks and looks to neutralize those security risks. But also we're looking at the next level, the next generation of technology. So neural networks, AI, big data, quantum cryptography are all part of our discussions that are happening across our various sites, certainly in the UK and beyond overseas. And we've claimed, as Carrie rightly said, we claim patent box and RDEC in respect of all these programs as best as we can where we are allowed to. And like for large companies like QinetiQ, the incentive increases the amount of cash that we have available for investment, which we try to then recycle through in our own internal R&D programs. And it allows also investment in early careers and other scientists, and keeps those existing scientists in the UK, and I think generates new research. So we're often asked by, as I mentioned earlier, to prove a direct causal link between R&D and these incentives. But I find it I've been trying to logic out and rationalize and reason why we find it very difficult. And these are 4 of the reasons which I think are primary for me. First of all, there's commercial sensitivity, the secrecy and the classification of some of these programs makes it very difficult to talk about the activities, particularly commercial sensitivities for businesses outside the defence sector. A cultural thing is a British thing where you don't discuss failure. You hate to admit failure, but equally find it very difficult to boast of success. It's promoted by tax people, which is not necessarily always the greatest audience to promote projects. But also, as a large organisation, it's very difficult to track that £1 of RDEC claimed or patent box reductions, tax saving, through all the way to the next level of science. It gets put into the pool of resource. For me, so finally, I would like to end on the fact that I think the incentives are really important and they need to remain. They're very attractive and they need to remain attractive, particularly after Brexit, and attractive internationally. It needs to be stable and certain, and provide these long R&D cycles from research to production makes it really important that R&D incentives are kept strong within the UK and enhanced, in my own mind, to allow us to then draw those best and the brightest of our STEM graduates and to keep that research and the researchers in the UK. So I think that's where I'm going to hand over back to Carrie, but and if there's any questions, I'm very happy to answer those now.
So, I mean, thank you, Peter, a fascinating insight into some of the projects. I guess being a tax professional myself, I was quite interested by your comment about R&D tax credits are promoted by tax people, I guess, like me. In the R&D consultation that was launched in the summer, they were asking about whether or not R&D tax relief should be moved outside the corporation tax return into a separate mechanism. And I just wondered what your thoughts were on that from a practical perspective.
What I think I love about the current regime is that it is technology agnostic. And I think you start handing the types of relief, the benefits that we get from the system into the hands of the grant suppliers, that they tend to become technology specific and driven, and you get a lot of leakage and waste as a result of that. So I think it's a great regime for providing a level playing field for all technologies to come forward, rather than governments to play kind of king or god in respect of how they want to allocate funds. I like our R&D tax relief on that basis.
And I suppose as we move to corporation tax on a quarterly basis with making tax digital, being able to potentially claim R&D tax relief on a quarterly basis would actually help the business and help the cash flow as well.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much for that. It's really interesting examples of how high-tech business has been supported by R&D incentives. Whilst elements of Kinetics business is I guess, literally rocket science, and its business model very clearly sits with R&D reliefs, that's not true for all businesses. As Peter said, R&D tax reliefs are available to many companies in other sectors, taking the leap into doing R&D to grow their business. So let's consider now what barriers there are to innovation. The CBI has investigated these in some detail and how the government can help reduce them. So I'm going to hand over to Sheldon now, who can explain a little bit more about this.
Thanks, Carrie, and also thanks, Peter. Now, just a bit of background on the CBI. As the UK's leading business organisation, the CBI speaks for some 190,000 businesses, either directly or indirectly, that together employ around a third of the private sector workforce, covering the full spectrum of businesses by sector and by size. Now, we've been actively lobbying on behalf of business on a number of areas that have been highlighted in various reports, such as our 2019 tax credit report, and through considerable representations to HMT, HMRC, through physical meetings and consultation responses. Now, when mentioning the R&D tax credit and the barriers, it is always important to echo some of what Vanessa has shared earlier on innovation. The R&D tax credit for a lot of large businesses is a key factor when making decisions on where to place investment. However, it is only one part of a collective package of measures which are essential to maintaining the UK's competitiveness. Can I have the next slide, please? If I piggyback off some of Peter's comments on capital, this is an area which the CBI has been looking at extensively over the last few years. We believe that the expansion of the scope of the R&D tax credit to include capital expenditure is and continues to be an argument that is well made. And with the recent WPI economics report laying out in detail how this new category of R&D would operate. The expansion of the scheme to include CapEx would for business be another weight on the scale which tips the long-term investment decisions of large multinational companies who may be looking at investing in permanent capital at a number of locations across the world. And this could be a key driver in the levelling up of the British regions, bringing high-skilled jobs and long-term sticky capital to the UK. This is of greater importance following the scarring effects of the economy that COVID-19 pandemic has undoubtedly caused. Although we were disappointed to not have a solid announcement on the addition of CapEx as an allowable expense in the most recent budget, what we are hearing from HMT is that the review of the R&D tax credit is still ongoing, and it is very much still on the table in terms of not too distant future changes. Now, with the green agenda and COP26 at the front of many of our minds, it's also worth mentioning another area the CBI have been doing some policy work on, and one which we have begun making representations on in our latest R&D consultation response and budget submission. And this is if and how the R&D tax credit can be used as a further lever to tackle climate change. Now, CBI members have expressed that the current R&D scheme currently overlooks its importance and role in the green agenda, as it doesn't offer any additional relief for projects which bring positive climate externalities. An additional deduction by the way of a simple enhancement to qualifying expenditure on green projects could be an effective way of encouraging the development and commercialization of green technologies. So at this moment in time, this is quite early stages in terms of development on this policy concept, but this is an area of big interest moving forward. Now, a lot of what I've talked about has been in reference to expanding the scope of the scheme, but CBI members have made it very clear that the simplicity of the R&D scheme is another key factor in its attractiveness. Maintaining this simplicity must be an area of focus for HMT and must also not come at the cost of reduction in the tax credit scope. Simplifying the R&D tax credit whilst building in this added flexibility will in the short term help this government to meet policy objectives such as net zero and the levelling up of British regions whilst retaining the key elements of the tax credit, which makes it such a popular scheme. And in the long term, the building in of this flexibility will allow the adjustment of the tax credit to meet future policy objectives without the need for a complete overhaul of the system. Now, the merging of the SME and RDEC system is one area of potential reform that has been discussed. However, we have been very strong on the case that any simplification must be a combination of both schemes, and care must be taken to prevent a reduction in the attractiveness of the tax credit to those firms who have historically made use of the SME scheme, particularly in relation to qualifying expenditure, the generosity of the scheme and the level of burden of application. Clearly, any such change to the current SME scheme should be subject to a transitional period, accompanied by guidance and support during the transitional period and beyond, to ensure no innovative business is left behind. And finally, on further budget announcements, as many of you will be aware, there was the announcement last week that the scope of the R&D tax credit will also be expanded to allow data and cloud costs as eligible expenditure. This is a welcome step in the right direction, and as Vanessa pointed out earlier on, as the CBI has long campaigned for the modernisation of the scheme. Now, the devil really is in the detail here, and as we wait for further information on what types of expenditure will be allowable, we will continue to push for a way for not only the purchasers of data and cloud resources to see benefit, but also the creators and the users of data. The final budget announcement pertaining to the R&D tax credit was the removal of entitled overseas R&D from the scope. Again, further detail is needed here to see the full picture on what this looks like for business. However, early anecdote from CBI members has suggested that the removal of relief for overseas R&D is understandable, considering the focus on expanding the scheme to improve the capture of onshore activities and the resulting spillover effects. Thank you very much. If I can pass back over to Carrie.
So thank you very much, Sheldon. And I was interested to hear your comment about capital expenditure and that there is some sort of seemingly some movement in HMRC's direction to allow CapEx in terms of the R&D tax credit, because I know that is a sentiment very much echoed by some of our clients that they would really like CapEx to be included. Katie, I just thought I'd hand over to you to see if you've got any observations on sort of the CBI's sort of view of how R&D relief should change.
I think it's really interesting, and actually we at BDO, as you know, Carrie, ran a survey earlier this year to our clients and contacts to ask what they'd like changes in the regime, and CapEx obviously was one of them, but the green piece as well came out really strongly, which was a surprise to me. I think over 70% of our respondents thought that R&D could well be used as a way of either creating social change or change on climate. So I echo what the CBI are saying here. I was a little disappointed that the budget didn't go further in terms of that modernisation that we've talked about as a theme today from R&D tax relief, and I hope, as Sheldon says, that conversation continues.
Brilliant. And Peter, if there was one thing that you could get into the sort of, if you were changing the scope of the R&D regime, what would that one change be?
I think I look at this in a very kind of straightforward fashion. I see R&D expenditure credits being very, very helpful for driving the activity of R&D. I see the patent box as a way of exploiting the output of that R&D. And what I see as being missing is the drive to have the investment in R&D, and hence, for me, the expansion of RDEC to include CapEx has a great strong logic. It fixes R&D in the UK with investment in the UK, which I think was a big theme of Rishi's budget.
Brilliant. So it'll be interesting on Thursday, which I think is when we're expecting the draft finance bill and the update on the R&D consultation, to see actually what is coming out there and to get a little more sort of guidance on the direction of travel. So if we pick up on Sheldon's last point about preventing the abuse of R&D tax reliefs, I think there were about 86,000 R&D claims made last year. And we've seen in the press that HMRC has recruited a further 100 R&D inspectors to inquire into R&D tax credit claims, and just to challenge that they're valid and that they're genuinely supporting R&D. So I thought I'd hand over to Katie just to give us a little bit on the focus on R&D claims, what it means for HMRC, what it means for companies in practice, and how HMRC's increased focus is impacting companies.
Yeah, thanks, Carrie, because actually we've heard an awful lot in this webinar so far on what the policies mean and how we've got one client experience of making those R&D claims. But actually another factor involved in all of this is how they're implemented in practice by HMRC. And many of you who've looked at R&D for a number of years will know that when the relief was first introduced, one of the things happened was that HMRC set up specialist units, which even helped companies to make R&D tax relief claim. And the approach there was very open and collaborative with the inspectors. And I think what we've seen is a gradual change, and that change has come about mainly because we're seeing an increase in R&D tax relief claims. So Carrie mentioned over 85,000 claims made last year. I think another important point there is that that was a 16% increase on the year before. So we really are seeing a fantastic rise in the in claiming R&D tax relief. But that rise has meant that instead of HMRC being the ones out in the market trying to promote the regime and its use by relevant companies, we're seeing a rise in more and more specialist R&D tax relief advisors who are picking up the phone. And Peter, and I'm sure a member of other of you who are making R&D tax relief claims will know that there are a number of salespeople out there marketing effectively for HMRC. But with that rise in the number of claims, I think it's fair to say that knowing HMRC's resource constraints, the increase in claims has been hard for them to manage. And Carrie touched on that 2020 HMRC annual report. That highlighted they think there is around about £300 million of either error or fraud in the R&D tax relief claims already being made. So this is an issue, and we will see HMRC tackling this. The report provided details of how they're going to approach that, and that includes, as Carrie mentioned, those new additions to the R&D tax relief team, but also a revised risk screening process and a random inquiry programme. Alongside the efforts of HMRC, we've actually also seen a change by ICAEW and other regulators who've updated their guidance on professional conduct in relation to taxation. And that's relevant here because it requires compliance advisors to assess R&D tax relief claims before submitting tax returns. So that provides a greater onus on the tax advisor rather than a specialist R&D boutique or people preparing claims in-house to make sure those claims are made on a sustainable basis. And when you take those two pieces together, we're really seeing a greater emphasis placed on the importance of getting those R&D claims right. So what am I seeing on the ground? Is certainly an increase in the number of R&D inquiries. And unfortunately, from our perspective, and for yours, I guess, making claims, a number of these are relatively generic. For me, they don't necessarily focus on the key issues that are involved in claims or technical points, and sometimes even ignore the documentation that's been submitted by companies in support of those claims, sadly. And I suppose in many ways that's to be expected, because if you recruit 100 new inexperienced people, you are going to see that experience come through in more standard type inquiry questions. And whether it's due to that additional process that's being implemented, or if it's due to just those increasingly growing volumes of R&D credits, we are unfortunately seeing some delays in the payment of R&D tax credits. So HMRC do have a stated aim of repaying SME R&D tax credits within 28 days. And they do send out regular email updates, which suggest those are being maintained, but we do see a number of outliers to that. So if you are making SME claims, it is important to keep track of when the cash will come in, because there are ways you can chase that. But I don't want to be the voice of doom in this webinar. Everyone else has been very positive about R&D, and I am very positive about R&D. All this additional attention just means that it's more important than ever that the R&D reports that you submit are robust and support your claims. And we've seen through various cases, including the Haddy case recently, that the lack of documentation and credible witnesses, so people within your business or external if necessary, to support the R&D claims were some of the factors that let that case down. So real good lessons learned going forwards. And I think some context is useful here too. So we started by looking at the UK as a global hub for innovation. The UK does have a lower level of audit compared to many other jurisdictions I'm aware of, such as the US and Canada. And also, while the UK scheme does recommend additional documentation is submitted, in many international jurisdictions, it's mandatory for project documentation to be reviewed, and in some cases before work is undertaken. So on a global stage, there are factors that are really in support of how we do things in the UK. But I wanted to finish with some practical advice, because again, that theory is useful, but how do you take that and implement that in your claims? So if I move on to my slide, Reese, I've got 4 sections where I think it's really worthwhile reflecting on those changes with HMRC and updating the way you do claims. So firstly, to coin a phrase, documentation, documentation, documentation. Making sure you have really solid summaries of the technical work undertaken will be your first line of defence against a potential HMRC inquiry. And as well as making sure that you've got the technical disclosure, making sure you disclose your methodology, how you've done things, and maintain good books and records will all help you should HMRC want to look at the claims that you've made. And as well as helping in the event of an inquiry, this should help prevent a discovery assessment where HMRC are not limited by their usual 2-year time frame to look at claims, but can go back many more years. And also could help prevent penalties should your claim be adjusted. So next, I'm bound to say this, but getting the right level of advice and support. So recently I helped a business that had prepared their R&D claims in-house, but they'd failed to spot over the years that the RDEC scheme is very different in some ways from the SME scheme. And unfortunately, they ended up facing a repayment of tax, several years of amended claims, and potential penalties. And getting the right advice up front in preparing those claims would have been really time-saving and cost-saving for that business. I've included a point here specifically on SME status, and I know that's irrelevant to some businesses like yours, Peter, but for others, this is a real area of importance. And many businesses automatically assume that they are SMEs because in everyday business, that's how it looks and feels. But the reality can be far more complex. So really considering carefully any links that you as a business have to others and any exemptions you're relying on, because we know HMRC are looking at this. And finally, changes to R&D and staying up to date with the regime. The relief might have been in operation now for nearly 20 years, but the rules really have changed over that time, whether it's the SME cap or the changes that Sheldon talked about just announced on data and cloud computing, or the changes on the international costs that your business may be facing. It's really important to make sure you consider those with each claim and make sure each is up to date. So I just want to finish by saying, whilst the environment for the claims has changed in terms of HMRC approach, companies should be encouraged by the success and that value that businesses like Kinetic and all of my clients derive from those R&D claims and make sure they get the right advice to do so. So hand back to you, Carrie, to pull that all together.
Brilliant. Thank you, Katie. And I think, Peter, I'm right in saying that Kinetic has never had an R&D inquiry. And I just wondered what factors you believe are sort of key to this.
Thank you, Carrie. Put you right just marginally, but we have been inquired into, and it is a very significant element for Kinetic, but we haven't had any adjustments as a result of an inquiry. Largely because we've put in place and we've worked and engaged upfront with HMRC in respect of our methodology, as Katie reflected on earlier, our writing up of the reports and making sure that HMRC are completely aware of our approach to making the claim. We are also looking back at ourselves. We're looking at our scientists and our engineers, and we get them engaged in the discussion as well. So we ensure we have not just a tax function brought into this and HMRC brought into it, but we also have our engineers and scientists brought into the process as well. So we've developed a technical panel within Kinetic. We are blessed with many projects and very many scientists, and therefore having a technical panel allows us to provide consistency across many of those projects, as well as a competent professional assessing whether the R&D nature of the activity that's been undertaken. So yes, we are lucky. I'm sure we will be inquired into shortly as a result of this, but or hopefully not as a result of this. But I think we are waiting and we're ready to answer questions from HMRC if they have any.
And it's really pleasing to hear that you've got the technical people, so the scientists and the engineers, engaged. And I know from personal experience, that's one of the things other companies struggle with. So are there any tips that you could give anybody listening on actually how to get the scientists and engineers engaged in the claims?
So first of all, we identify, we tell them of the benefits the regime provides for Kinetic as a whole. So we are telling them initially the real value to our business of having these claims put in place and having them robustly made. They then have bought into the process right from the word go. We also I'm afraid I also have to say to them, well, it will occupy some of their time, but we will try and limit that time as much as we possibly can by stepping in where we can actually provide our expertise as well as tax people. So we try and limit the amount of time that these scientists and engineers are taken away from doing the actual activity of R&D to writing up a report on that activity for HMRC. And we also try and get HMRC onto site and to talk to these technical people, because I think that brings everything alive. It takes it off the page and brings it into the real world, and they can see the advancements and developments that are being undertaken.
Yeah, and I can certainly imagine that seeing some of the propulsion or the sort of the robotics and going into space, it's, yeah, it really sort of fascinates HMRC. So yes.
But it makes my job extremely fun to do. Previously, you know, without R&D expenditure credits, I think I would have, you know, tax can be quite bland, but adding the opportunity to then talk to scientists and technicians and technical folk about the work they're doing is just makes the job absolutely a joy, to be honest.
And I think that's why Katie and I both went into R&D, because the companies we work with are doing some amazing things, and just being part of it, yeah, yes, really fulfilling. Brilliant. So thank you. I'd like to thank all our speakers today. Really insightful. So we've looked at how the UK can become a global innovation hub. We've heard some stories, some success stories from Kinetic. We've considered how the R&D regime might be changing and some of the barriers to innovation. And then we've heard from Katie about HMRC's current approach to inquiring into R&D claims. And I think we've got a couple of minutes left for questions if anybody wants to submit them into the chat function. But whilst you're doing so, I thought I'd just ask one of Vanessa. Picking up on the 2.4% GDP target for the UK to become a global innovation hub, do you think that's enough? Is that ambitious enough?
Thank you, Carrie. And I think, as I said earlier, as we all know, securing business investment in innovation is fiercely competitive, and our global competitors are investing with both scale and urgency to leverage as much business investment as possible. So questions do remain over whether our new commitments will go far enough or fast enough to compete. And it's vital that we present a compelling enough offer to make the UK a global innovation hub. So essentially, the 2.4% target is a really important milestone, but it's absolutely critical that this does not represent an endpoint. We need to go beyond that and stretch our ambitions much further. But I'd say in the shorter term, with that target in mind, it does place much more onus on non-financial measures as well to make sure that we maximise the benefits and simplify the ecosystem, as I mentioned earlier.
Lovely. And we've got one question that's come in from the chat for Katie. So we've talked a bit about the budget announcements last week about R&D reform, and more detail coming out in the finance bill on Thursday. So the question is, what should companies who are worried about those budget changes that were announced, what should they be doing now?
Yes, I've had a few tense conversations about what's happening in the budget. So firstly, I guess the importance is that the changes that we've been talking about won't come in until April 2023. So for most businesses, this is a couple of years into the future and something that can be planned for. Really, we'll know more on Thursday when we have the detailed information, but I'd recommend companies now start to look at what overseas costs do we have as a business and what's the cash impact of those at the moment from a UK perspective. We will be making representations on behalf of clients and contacts. So if you do have feedback about how that detail is going to affect you in your claims, and do contact me or Carrie. We'd be happy to feed in your comments, as I'm sure would be the CBI, to know your views. I guess one other thing to think about when you think about those overseas costs is whether you've made local R&D tax relief regime claims, because in many situations it may be that those costs are eligible for a local R&D tax credit, even if it going forwards from 2023 they may not be part of the UK claims. So I would be looking at what part of my claims could be at risk, and then as that documentation becomes available on Thursday, understanding to what extent, because that is a question unanswered at this point.
Brilliant. And I guess from my perspective, for some of my FS and fintech clients, we're actually now doing a little bit of modeling on we can bring in the cloud computing costs, we can bring in the data costs, we may have to take out the overseas costs. So as an overall message, what are R&D claims going to look like? So we can start messaging that to our key stakeholders. So there may well be a sort of a modeling exercise to do as well. So just wrap up by saying a big thank you to Vanessa, Sheldon, Peter and Katie for joining me today. And I hope you found that very useful and informative. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much indeed.